Welcome to our program tonight. It is the history of the Bureau of Explosives. I'm Scarlett Wirt, and I'm the program chair for the Washington, D.C. chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and a special welcome for those of you who are with us for the first time. Our mission, for those of you who are not really aware much about our club, our mission is to expand the public appreciation of railroading, both the railroad operations and their history through preservation and education. We do this in a whole lot of different ways. Obviously, public programs like tonight. We have a railroad library. We have a monthly newsletter on railroad topics. We also sponsor Rail Camp every year. This is an opportunity for high school students to have experience with Amtrak. It's sponsored by the NRHS, and it lets them learn a little bit about what a career in railroading might be like. So that's pretty important to us. And then, of course, rail operations. We have 3 Amtrak qualified rail cars, 2 Bud passenger cars, the Franklin and Collinsville Inn cars, and then, of course, the Dover Harbor, kind of a jewel of the fleet, 1923 heavyweight Pullman car. These cars are all Amtrak qualified, and they go anywhere in the country, exposing a whole new generation of people to rail travel and the golden age of rail travel. So tonight, our program is the history of the Bureau of Explosives. And as we were putting together our 2021 program, one of our board members, Jim Perry, offered to pull together this program. And to be honest, I didn't know much about the Bureau at that time. As we have gotten into this, I've grown to realize that this organization is really at the forefront of the railroad industry's hazmat safety program, and is the genesis for what we know today, the safety standards that are followed by the railroads. So tonight's program has some history, and it also is personal. Jim Perry is a veteran railroader. He is a alumni of the Bureau of Explosives and also Western Pacific Railroad and Rail Inc. He's assembled a real panel of veterans, a who's who in this industry for us tonight. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the program that you all have for us. So with all that being said, I'd like to turn this over now to Jim Perry to start the program.
Thank you, Scarlett. Very kind introduction. And greetings, everybody. I want to introduce the panel this evening that will be assisting with this presentation. Ann Mason, of course, is the most important one. Well, she did an awful lot of research, and she's the professional slide maker, and she's the Zoom expert, and she made this all happen. She was the environmental manager at the Bureau in the 80s, and then she went to the Chemical Manufacturers Association, which became American Chemistry Council. Also with us is Alan Mady. He was an inspector and then a chief inspector, and then he formed his own consulting company doing consulting in the hazmat rail transportation area. And Paul Williams was the manager of operations analysis at the Bureau. And then he went to the Transportation Test Center in Pueblo, Colorado. And then he left to go to the regional manager of hazardous materials at Norfolk Southern. Alan Richter helped a lot with the program. He he's a former inspector who went to Conrail. He had a nice stash of old inspector reports that he gave to me, which was the basis for a lot of the information I'll be providing later. He can't be with us this evening, unfortunately. Here's an outline of what we'll be talking about. The early rail transportation of explosives, and how the Bureau got organized and how it got started in its early days. Then we'll turn to what it's been doing in the modern era, and we'll be talking about how the mission has changed over the years, and then we'll talk about one notable character that the Bureau people that are with me this evening all remember fondly. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Ann to talk about the history of explosives business.
Thanks, Jim. So we have, just to set the context for why was the Bureau it started in the first place? Well, black powder was the most common thing that was shipped on the railroads at the time when the railroads was being created in the 1860s in the United States. But black powder by itself was first invented by the Chinese in the 9th century. And it's a mixture of some sort of a charcoal fuel, an oxidizer like saltpeter, and a stabilizer, usually sulfur. It's easily ignited and it burns rapidly. And the two manufacturers that started in the United States were on the East Coast, but the time what we're going to be talking about, they also had a manufacturing facility throughout the United States, and we're going to be talking about the West Coast in a minute. The other early explosives, besides black powder, were nitroglycerin that was formed in Europe in the 1847, and it's usually shipped as a liquid, and it is very sensitive to shock. It has a lot of energy, so it can really make a big hole, if you will. But they, in a search for trying to find some way to harness this energy from nitroglycerin, Alfred Nobel invented dynamite in the 1860s. And that was made up of nitroglycerin, which is absorbed into some sort of an earth or a clay and mixed with a stabilizer. In the United States, the first manufacturer was in California. Now, the shelf life of dynamite is about a year, and if you don't store it flat, you store it upright, it starts to weep nitroglycerin, which forms a little puddle, and that forms a little problem. So we're going to start our trip about explosives back when the Transcontinental Railroad was started. Now, if we look at this map, we see this insert with a topography starting out here in San Francisco, going up to Sacramento. It's pretty nice and flat, and the Central Pacific had charge of that part of the construction. Once they hit Sacramento, they hit the Sierra Nevadas. And the Sierra Nevadas is a wonderful, beautiful granite mountain range that stretches for miles and miles. On the other end, the Western Pacific, the Union Pacific, was coming out of Omaha west. And they had a pretty nice, easy construction up until they hit some of the mountains. So we can really think of the use of explosives from a railroad experience really pointed toward the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. But the Eastern railroads have the Appalachians and the Alleghenies, and that's plenty of granite too. So black powder and the other explosives were in big supply and well used by the railroads. Well, just look at looking at this part of the Summit Tunnel, which is one of the entrances to the Sierra Nevadas. When the Central Pacific started working on the Sierra Nevadas, they found that black powder was insufficient in its own energy. They needed something more. And the something more that they started to use was nitroglycerin. And we'll talk a little bit about the story about nitroglycerin in San Francisco in a minute. But what they did after a series of explosions in the shipment to San Francisco for nitroglycerin, they decided that the way to make nitroglycerin safer for the use of the railroad construction in the Sierras was to manufacture nitroglycerin at the site. So they created a little manufacturing operation right there in Donner Pass, and they identified James Howden to make nitroglycerin from the raw materials that they brought in, which were glycerin, nitrate, and sulfuric acid. And what they did to try to control the explosives potential was only to make enough that they used on that day. So when we look at going through the Sierras, we can see that we know that there is explosive power that was used and a lot of manpower. And so the building of the Transcontinental Railroad really is a story about chemical power and human power. So when we look at the production of explosives in the United States over the years, you'll see that black powder was in the 1864, and that was not very much of it, but what was transported was usually transported by rail or by overland. Rail was safer. And when you look at what was being used, 80% was being used for coal mining, and for dynamite, a little more than half was used in the railroad and other construction and mining. Now, round about the turn of the century, the last century, the 1900s, James McRae, who was at that time president of the Pennsylvania Railroad and a leader in the American Railway Association, testified to Congress that 3,300 freight cars per day carried explosives on the rail. So let's talk a little bit about nitroglycerin and what happened in the beginning of this. April 16th, 1866. There was a terrible explosion at the Wells Fargo yard in San Francisco, and it consisted of a box marked general merchandise that was leaking. It was set aside and put into the warehouse. It was brought to San Francisco on a passenger steamer from Panama. And when the Wells Fargo agent and the shipper's agent went to examine this box, they used a crowbar and it exploded. Many people dead, scores more injured. The Wells Fargo building flattened, and all glass a quarter of a mile around that area broken. Well, this was one of the third or fourth major explosions of nitroglycerin on a passenger vessel. Congress immediately stepped in and forbade any explosives on passenger vehicles. And Wells Fargo stepped in and said they were not going to receive any more nitroglycerin. That was the beginning of regulation relating to explosives. That didn't stop the accidents from happening. Dynamite, nitroglycerin, black powder, all had their episodes of exploding until we saw the Pennsylvania Railroad step in, one of the largest at the time, and they had been refusing shipments of explosives. But recognizing that it was going to be on their railroad because of interchange, they set up a testing laboratory in 1875 under Charles Dudley, who was a chemist at the time. And at that time, they decided that they would set up the rules of shipping explosives on the Pennsylvania Railroad. They adopted most of the British rules that were established in 1875. And they recognized that while they had hands off on explosives up until a point, they still looked at who the manufacturers were on their rail lines and recognized that they had 48 manufacturers along their roads. And they knew that they needed to form some rules because they were getting interchange with other railroads with these dangerous goods on their line until 1903. 1903 was a freight car loaded with dynamite exploded in the Crestline, Ohio yard of the Pennsy Railroad. The noise was reportedly heard 50 miles away. There was a gigantic hole. Workers a mile away were knocked off their feet. The debris on the main line was 10 feet high with 30 tracks involved and over 100 rail cars. And amazingly, no one was killed. That catalyzed into action of James McRae and Charles Dudley, who went to Congress on their own as the Pennsylvania Railroad and pressed Congress for federal regulations. They were rebuffed by a lot of opposition and a lot of lobbying. So they brought their case to the American Railway Association and asked that a committee be appointed to look at establishing uniform regulations for the shipment of explosives and other dangerous goods. Well, while the committee had been formed and while they were under discussion, another Pennsylvania railroad accident happened in May of 1905, this time at the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania yards. A 68-car train was moving slowly through the yard. It made an emergency stop to avoid hitting the train ahead of it. Half the train, the front half of the train, had air brakes. The rear half of the train did not have air brakes. The rear half of the train collided with the front half of the train, and cars buckled and derailed onto the next track. Unfortunately, at that time, there was an incoming passenger train that plowed into these boxcars and set off a carload of dynamite. 23 people were killed and 110 injured, and it became front page news on the New York Times and a lot of other regional railroads. It got the attention of the other railroads with the headline, "People Roasted to Death in the Debris." So in June of 1905, the ARA committee sought input from manufacturers and cities. And Charles Dudley gathered experts to develop a technical report, which they were required to deliver in their October meeting of the ARA. And in that report, they identified the manufacturers on every other member railroad of the ARA. In October, having received this report, the members adopted a set of rules and decided not to compromise safety in competition and in interchange, and directed the formation of the Bureau of Explosives to enforce their association rules. In March, they had a formal vote of the 185 railroads adopted the rules, and that represented 124,000 track miles. At the same time, in 1906, ARA submitted 2 bills to Congress. So here we have the establishment of the first set of regulations self-policing the rail transportation of explosives. In 1908, the Railway Association added the transportation rules for inflammable articles and acids. Meanwhile, the bills in Congress that had been submitted were heard in 1908. Congress modified them, debated them, and passed the Explosives and Combustibles Act. This was the first federal regulation, besides that earlier one that was on passenger vehicles. This covered vessels. This covered railroads. Now, the railroads had been regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission Act, passed in 1887. And that act was really to look at the monopoly and the tariff regulations associated with the railroads. That group, federal regulatory body, existed. So in the 1908 Act, Congress delegated to the ICC the authority to regulate rail transportation of explosives, gave them 90 days to promulgate the regulations. Now, anybody who knows about regulatory establishment, that is not a lot of time. So the ICC commissioners met with the association, and after some modification, adopted the ARA rules on explosives and left the enforcement with the Bureau of Explosives. Now, what about all the rest of the materials that the railroads were self-policing, the flammable materials and the gases? It was not until 1921 when the federal government made an act regulating those. So here we have the formation of the Bureau of Explosives in January of 1906. And the ARA formed the Constitution, the bylaws for the Bureau. And in those bylaws, they said that every railroad needed to have some railroad expertise on explosives and dangerous good transportation. For the members of the ARA, the Bureau of Explosives work was part of their dues. But any railroad who didn't want to use the Bureau expertise needed to form their own team of experts. The ARA also said that there would be a common enforcement mechanism so that there wouldn't be individual modification of the rules, that everybody would operate by a same set of uniform rules. And the ARA also established the Bureau as a repository of information on the safe transportation of materials by rail. And I want to just further note that the Bureau of Explosives is part of this self-policing of the railroads. This was a railroad set-up organization. It's not part of a governmental agency. So the railroads were looking around, trying to establish this Bureau of Explosives, and recognized that in order to bring satisfactory expertise that would satisfy the railroads, the shippers, the regulators, and the public, they needed to bring in some expertise that was, everybody would agree, would be the best. They recruited Colonel Beverly Dunn, who was a West Point graduate, and with lots of experience in artillery and ordnance. And the railroads really wanted Colonel Dunn to help them with the establishment of their regulations, and went to the Secretary of War and asked for Colonel Dunn to be having special duty assigned for the task of regulations and establishment of the Bureau of Explosives. So by the detail of the Secretary of War, Colonel Beverly Dunn came to the Bureau of Explosives and worked to establish the regulations with the Charles Dudley and the other staff, and then started to work with the Bureau of Explosives as the senior director, the senior inspector. So in the early days, here we are, June of 1907, the founding and the opening date of the Bureau of Explosives, with Charles Dudley as the president, Colonel Dunn as the chief inspector, with the laboratory, and with 17 inspectors and 1 special agent. During that time, they had 78 carriers representing 40% of the track mileage, 130,000 miles. Now, eventually, they allowed associate members to come in. Those were shippers, packaging people, and other manufacturers, provided they paid dues. And that helped the Bureau of Explosives form the network that we know now as the Bureau of Explosives. So this was voluntary compliance by educating key railroad personnel. Now at that time, when we think about 1908, just a year after the formation, in addition to explosives, there were lots of other dangerous goods that were shipped by rail. And if you look at some of these, we have to recognize that some of these are not the same products as we now know today. So Jim is going to tell us a little bit about a couple of these items.
First of all, it should be mentioned that at this time there was a lot of material sent by less than carload shipments and express shipments. So things like matches, for example, would probably be not sent in carload quantities, but these matches were dangerous because they were strike anywhere matches, and any rocking of the car is going to cause friction, which can make them go if the packages were too large. Charcoal was a problem because it was often sent in bulk, and it was often loaded into cars too soon after being formed, and it was still hot. And there were numerous cases of cars catching fire, so-called spontaneously, and the fire hadn't been extinguished to begin with. Picture film. At the time, this was acetate film, nitrocellulose, extremely unstable, and it was often shipped in express cars or by couriers, by passenger car, and not always properly labeled, not always understood by the courier. And we'll get to Colonel Dunn in a few minutes, but one of the things, when he had a problem with a particular industry, he would visit the leaders, the manufacturers, and work with them on developing solutions. And in this case, the motion picture industry knew they had a problem because their theaters were burning down. So they worked with them to make sure these things were properly packaged and labeled and educated. Of course, the problem really didn't go away until we got to safety film.
So I should have mentioned that the formation of the Bureau of Explosives included the railroads in the United States and Canada at that time. One of the things that, because we had less than carload shipments, as Jim mentioned, we see on the photos on the left that sometimes boxcars had mixed freight, had boxes, bicycles, wheels, wooden lumber, unsecured kegs. And that can result in, because of the shifting on the rails, things moving around. And if you've got an explosives in that load, it can result in the picture in the middle, where you have lots of damage and lots of wreckage. So one of the first tasks the Bureau of Explosives did was to establish a series of pamphlets informing the railroads and shippers on how to safely load and restrain cargo in boxcars. So you see on the right the loading and bracing for boxes and for kegs. And the establishment of pamphlets became a routine part of Bureau of Explosives. Now, should we pause for questions here?
This is a little bit of an outline of what we'll be talking about in the next session, but we do have some questions. Shall I go ahead, Scarlett?
Yes, please. If you've got them, take it.
Okay. There was a question about torpedoes. What was the question, actually?
As in signal detonators.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
torpedoes is a general term which means different things to different people. I think John has one idea of what a torpedo is.
From the Navy perspective, yeah.
And in the railroad industry, we used to use them as to signal following trains that there was a train ahead of you. They're in the railroad business. There are small explosive devices that you put on the head of a rail, and when the locomotive goes over it, it goes off as a signal to the engineer. Of course, they have to be shipped carefully and handled carefully. So the questioner points out that evidently one was involved in the 1900 wreck to claim the life of Casey Jones on the Illinois Central.
Also, Jim, there was another question about torpedoes, wondering whether they were in standard use at the beginning of the 20th century, and if so, what agency controlled their use and distribution?
Well, I don't know for sure. I'm guessing they had to be approved by the Bureau. And
the Bureau did have a testing procedure for those. Basically, they set up a amount of cheesecloth next to the railroad, and they would explode those, and the shrapnel could only fly so far. but they were a Class A explosive, I believe, and they were approved by the Bureau of Explosives. And as far as I know, the railroads are no longer using those.
Yeah.
There's another question about charcoal.
Yeah, a question about charcoal and whether that's still a problem. Charcoal, bagged charcoal is regulated as an RMD, at least when I was other regulated material. If it catches fire in a rail car, it's difficult to put out. I think the procedure is to empty the car and keep it underwater until it's all burned up.
Well, you were saying in the early days of shipping charcoal, it was shipped in bulk and it was loaded warm. So it was already pretty good fuel for catching on fire.
I don't believe it's a current issue. Anything else?
That's it. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, sure. We're going to be talking over the course of the next few minutes, the role of the laboratory, what the inspectors do, providing advice to railroads and shippers, and then how we provide technical support to railroads, hazmat guides, and tank car committee and the regulations, the Red Book. This is the a staff meeting in October of 1913. And our Colonel Dunn is the gentleman in the center of the front row. And they're all distinguished people. And again, these are, they cover both Canada and the US, yes. The annual reports of the chief inspectors covered all the activities of the Bureau. And it's actually the collection that Alan sent me is the source of a number of the statistics we're going to be following this with. The membership increased rapidly from the beginning, both in terms of number of carriers and track miles. Of course, railroads were a lot smaller then, and the situation has changed dramatically in the last few years. Well, in the last 40, 50 years. We're now looking at 20 members of the AAR and then 7 Class 1 members. So it's a much different situation than the Bureau was facing in 1907, 1910. This is Bureau data, accident data from 1908 to 1964. One of the remarkable things is the drop in fatalities in the first few years of the Bureau working to educate and to both shippers and railroads on proper handling, labeling, shipping documents for explosives. The number of fatalities went down from like 50 a year to virtually zero, in the low digits, single digits, until till present time. And so the number of injuries in World War I, 1916, there was an incident, Black Tom, New Jersey, which is a dock on the New Jersey coast in New York Bay, where explosives intended for Europe were held until they could be taken by small ships, ferries, lighters is what they're actually called, to a location in New York Bay set aside for handling explosives. Well, those ships, the timing on those was unknown, and this yard at Black Tom filled up with a lot more than was safe. And an incident happened there on July 30th, 1916, caused initially by a fire which Colonel Dunn thought was of suspicious circumstances. But in any case, there was so much material of a wide variety of hazardous explosive material that two major explosions happened that could be felt in downtown Manhattan and killed about 4 fatalities, 4 people, and 107 injuries. So that's the big spike in World War I. Another example how this is the accident rate. The yellow line in the bottom left is explosives dropping from 50 or so a year to virtually nothing. Of course, it did go up. The number of accidents went up, especially in World War II, but fatalities and injuries was much less. A lot of other materials, hazardous materials, were being shipped, and so the focus changed to these flammable liquids like gasoline and LPG and so on. And that's where peaked in about 1919, 1920, and then gradually has fallen since then. The laboratory, the picture on the left is Mr. Nady with Dr. Chen, an assistant chemist at the time, and our trainee, inspector trainee, was going through. It was used to classify samples sent in by shippers wanting to have their material approved for shipment, and inspectors would send samples if there was an incident and they questioned the material. They could have it sent to the lab and examined. On the right, we have a impact test apparatus for classification of explosives. A lot of the procedures, testing procedures and equipment designs are still in use by a variety of organizations.
Yeah, including some internationally.
Yes.
So we talked a little bit about the publications, and the publication that Pat Student and I worked on in the 80s was the Emergency Handling Guide. This was originated as pamphlet 7A in 1970, a small pocket-sized book about this size. And by the time that Pat and I were working on this document, it is at least twice the size and
3 or 4 times the size.
and many hundreds of pages longer. But the important thing is that this was the first compilation of how do you handle hazardous materials in transportation. And this became
Accidents.
in accidents, and this became something that our inspectors used to guide their emergency response, and they used to help train the railroad people and the shippers.
And emergency responders.
And first responders, very important, first responders. Can you talk about this?
We published the tariff was a compilation of the Title 49, the Hazardous Materials Regulations, AOT. The Government Printing Office has a version, of course, but they only issued it once a year. We offer quarterly updates so that railroads and shippers could be more current.
So when we think about the emergency response, I know that one of the things that I was working on was working in a joint committee with the Department of Transportation, who started to take the emergency response guidebooks and handling and really standardize it for the government. And the Bureau of Explosives, as well as the Chemical Manufacturers Association, worked with the Coast Guard and the DOT and other representatives to form the federal response booklets that really help everybody. Donna said the publication is in 1770s. Is there no federal oversight? Yes. From the emergency response side now, there is a great deal of collaborative work that's going on. In a different talk, we can talk all about how the railroads and the shippers have gotten together to form a notification system called Chemtrec, which is operated by the chemical manufacturers, now under the ACC, the American Chemistry Council. But in the days subsequent to the 70s and 80s, there's a whole network of emergency response interactions and training that is going on. And Paul and Al are going to talk specifically about some of the work that they've been doing and that the association has been doing in recent time. It's significant and it's collaborative.
Here is the esteemed group in 1984 at a staff meeting. Some of our Paul and Mr. Mady are in here, as well as Miss Mason and Jack Southworth. I think his son had registered. I don't know if he is with us at the moment.
There's another guy in the background there that's currently on the call.
Oh, Mr. Rader?
Mr. Rader.
Hey!
Fantastic.
Oh, terrific.
Hello, everyone. I want to say, I'm surprised you didn't recognize me on the video.
Well, no, we've all changed a little bit. If anybody's worried, I'm not in this picture. I had left to go to Railink just earlier that year.
So now we're going into the operations side of this, and we're turning it over to Alan and Paul.
I guess that's me.
That's you.
One of the primary things that the Bureau inspectors did up until probably the mid-1990s were what are called member plant inspections. Chemical companies, different shippers could have an associate membership in the Bureau of Explosives. They were entitled to an annual inspection. We would go into the facility, we would review their shipping documents that they provided to either the railroad or a trucking company. We would review the packaging of their materials, make sure it was in a proper DOT authorized package. Labeling were small diamond shaped items placed on the package itself. We look at loading and unloading of tank cars or other bulk shipments. And at one point in time, DOT required what were called hazmat employees. These were shipper carrier personnel that their jobs entailed hazmat. They were required to have annual or initial training and then training every 3 years. And that became one of the big activities of the Bureau of Inspectors, was conducting this training for both the shippers and in some cases the railroads.
These chemical plants, say Dow or DuPont, would get one membership, but they would ask for anywhere from 1 to 20 or 30 different plants to be inspected every year by these inspectors. So we had hundreds of member plants. And one of the other functions that the BOE inspectors did is they went into the railroad yards and looked at their operations and how they handled hazardous materials while they were in the yard. They would go in and look at this time they had 8 local agencies. So you had paperwork at the agency building there in the yard. So they'd go in and look at hazmat paperwork to make sure that the shipping descriptions were correct. They'd look at securement of the rail car and the material on the rail cars. They would look at stenciling. They would look at placarding. They would look at train placement and things like that to make sure that the railroads were complying with the federal regulations. This was, we'd rather have a BOE guy come in and tell you you're doing something wrong than the feds come in and tell you something wrong and then ask you for money. They also did railroad employee training at no charge to the railroads. Again, they would teach them how to do shipping papers, what placards were, what they're used for, where they were supposed to be, the labeling, the marking. Again, talking about train placement, switching, when train placement applies and switching moves and when it doesn't. The railroads eventually transitioned to centralized billing so that there wasn't a local agent at every agency building on the railroad. So the BOE changed over and started doing annual audits of the hazmat shipping papers at a railroad's headquarters. So they'd go in there and spend a couple of days looking through shipping papers tendered by the carrier and then match that up to the waybill created by the railroad to make sure that the railroads were actually producing shipping papers correctly. They also provided posters and things like that for railroads use. Well, in the early days, they did a lot of transferring of hazardous materials on team tracks rather than just a shipper's facility. So this is a picture of what happens when you run one train past a car that's being unloaded in the process of being unloaded. And you end up with an ensuing fire. So one of the other things they did is looked at loading and unloading of tank car facilities like Al was speaking about earlier. And one of the other talked about is when is a tank car empty and when is it loaded. Tank cars are just as hazardous, if not more so, when they're empty because that 20 or 30,000 gallons of liquid's now been replaced by vapors. In this case here, someone went down in the car to perform a repair. Car wasn't evacuated or cleaned and purged, and they struck an arc and they became a human cannonball. So again, this is some of the things the Bureau is designed to prevent. Talk to people, repair shops, make sure the cars are cleaned and purged, etc.
The Bureau in the old days published quarterly bulletins sent widely distributed to railroads and written in a style that would be interesting to read by frontline workers. I don't know if you can read what that says, but under the picture caption, the commodity is gasoline. The little difficulty shown in the above picture is perhaps, and also unfortunately, not altogether unusual. It happened a while back, but we've just laid our hands on the picture. In our humble opinion, it's the most wonderful picture of a wreck and fire we've seen yet, and we can't resist the temptation to print it. So he's got a real sense of humor, and that style kind of went away when Colonel Dunn went away. Oh, but the point was to generate interest, to change behavior, provide statistics on where we're having problems, and designed to improve things like car design and training. Here's Mr. Meady again.
This was back around 1980. We had direction from Washington that we always had to present a good appearance to everybody. So we always wore our neckties. This was a case, a tank car had been involved in a derailment and it was loaded onto a flat car and moved to a tank car repair facility, and they claimed it had too much pressure. So it was returned to the railroad. The tank car is over to the right, and we're just flaring off vapor. The cylinder behind me there is a propane cylinder we use as a pilot light to keep the fire going. We worked on this project for about 3 days. The tank car facility came over, they took a pressure reading and said the car was okay to go back into the repair shop.
But that was a function that the railroads relied on the Bureau of Explosives for, was expertise in emergency response and train accidents, because at that time the railroads didn't have their own people. They relied on the BOE inspectors to come out and respond when they had non-accident releases as well as accidents.
I was looking back at some of my old timesheets we had to fill in, and we were responding probably each inspector sometimes once, if not twice a week, to an incident, whether it was a leaking tank car, derailments or something like that. So we were 24 hours, 7 day a week call.
This is an interesting situation. You can see that this car has been in a serious derailment and suffered quite a bit of abuse. What is not obvious is that there were 5 cars involved here, each containing 15-ton containers. They're actually ICC 106A containers of chlorine. And the car is totally destroyed, but out of the 75 containers, none of them leaked. And you see on the left, on the right, that was a pretty significant dent, and the container did not fail.
We're going to talk about Roy Holt in a minute, but one of the things he always impressed upon me, at least, was that a tin can, that shape, is a really strong shape as long as it's properly constructed. And we'll talk a little bit more, but this is one of those points that he would say, look at that dent. And he would go on and on about what that dent meant and how close it was. We'll talk about Roy in a couple minutes.
We've also got a couple of questions, so when you're ready for those, let me know.
I think we'll take those in just a minute, Scarlett. Okay, Al.
This was an incident in northern Missouri many, many years ago. There was a train derailment. This was a tank car of hydrochloric acid. It was on its side. We had a small leak because some bolts were not properly tightened when the car was shipped. So we just went up there with our little toolbox and tightened the bolts, and everything was okay. The car could be uprighted and then continue to transportation or have the contents transferred. And this is an incident, not too common, but it does happen. In this particular case, this tank car was being unloaded through a bottom outlet valve. They did not open any fitting on the top to allow air to enter into the car. And after a point in time when all the liquid was drawn out, the vapor was drawn out, the tank car imploded or collapsed. You can't fix that with Bondo. And we do have a little snippet coming up right here. This was done in Europe.
Wow.
Thanks, Al. That was good.
Some of you may remember on, what was that show? The
Mythbusters.
yeah, they attempted to do the same thing in real life, and they didn't use the proper procedure to make the car implode the way it should have. But there's just an example of what can happen. As you saw, that was instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a thing.
Is this a good time to take a couple of those questions?
Good as any.
Yeah.
So the question Donna asked is, what was the average length of service of an inspector and how many were lost while at work?
Well, when I started, we had 25 inspectors in the United States and Canada, and I volunteered for Rhode Island and Connecticut, but they turned me down on that. I think we got down probably at one time we had probably 10 inspectors. And we became a training ground for the Federal Railroad Administration hazmat inspectors. We had quite a few inspectors got trained by us and went to the FRA. There's one guy right there I see on the camera.
Yeah.
And it was okay, you know, things happen like that. We never did lose any inspectors. We had very few even injuries. I was more concerned when I was a manager of somebody being hurt in a car accident driving back and forth day and night, or being mugged in a motel somewhere. But we never did lose anybody. We lost a few because of their performance. They were let go. But other than that, everybody was pretty safe.
Al, I think we lost one at the lab.
Yeah, but as far as the field inspectors, really, if there were any injuries, they were minor. I remember the time I stuck my thumb in my eyeball when I was flipping the wheel in the art office. But other than that, nobody was really ever hurt too bad.
And I don't have the data on the length of service, but Al, how many years did you serve on the Bureau?
36.
36. And Paul, how about you?
About 17 or so.
Okay. And Jim Rader, how about you?
I was there a short time. I'm the one that escaped and went to FRA. So I've been in hazmat since '83, and Al Mady is my mentor. I'm a prodigy of Al. So.
Oh, son of Al.
What's your address? I'll send you a little something.
So I don't know that we know the data, Donna, to answer your question about the length of service, but it was many people started and stayed years and years and years. We had a little party always. We called ourselves the Masters of Disasters.
Well, let me get one from Mr. Eldridge.
Uh-huh.
He's asking about the connection between the Bureau of Explosives and the Bureau of Mines. And obviously there was correspondence and communication between the two, but, and the Bureau of Mines, I think, took over some of the activities after the Bureau lost some of its
After the
delegation
lab,
of,
after the lab incident.
yeah. Is there any other things, Scarlett?
Well, and the other question that Eldridge has asked is, does the Bureau still operate under the ARA?
No.
The ARA, American Railway Association, was disbanded, and the Association of American Railroads was formed. These things happened seamlessly, and the Bureau of Explosives was under the Association of American Railroads. So the short answer to your question is the Bureau of Explosives has been under a railroad association since its inception.
And we have one final question outstanding. Today, when explosives are moved by rail, are towns along the route notified, or are any special preparations made associated with the route?
The answer would be no.
But we're going to go into the training right now, and we'll come back to that question because local firefighters and police are part of the training activities that the railroads have put together. So Paul and Al, go ahead and take it from there, and we'll come and answer that question a little bit later.
Well, one of the functions of the Bureau was training not only member plants and shippers, but also emergency responders as well. The training that they provided to chemical companies, member plants, they charged for, they did not charge training for the railroads or emergency responders. And one of the functions that the BOE did at one time back in the early 80s was start a hazmat seminar because we saw a need for it. There was a lot of information that wasn't getting disseminated. So the AAR started doing an annual hazmat seminar, and there you can see that's Mr. Matty at the BOE booth there. That was Stump the Doctor. Anybody who could stump Mr. Matty with a regulatory question got that T-shirt hanging in the background. Say, I stumped the doctor.
We only gave away one T-shirt.
Yeah, he's good. It has grown. The Bureau, as we'll talk about in a little while, has transitioned to some other things, but that training outreach by the carriers continues today. We use the TransCare, which is a outreach program through the Chemical Manufacturers Association. Right? No, American Chemistry Council.
American Chemistry Council.
They keep changing their name.
It was the Chemical Manufacturers Association when it was created, TransCare, but it's now the American Chemistry Council.
They have an outreach program called TransCare, which is Transportation Emergency Awareness and Community Awareness and Emergency Response. And under that program, all the class 1s and some short lines still continue to provide training to emergency responders in the areas through which rails traverse. All the carriers have trailers which have domes, fittings on them that you would normally see on a tank car, and that picture there is the Norfolk Southern one, but CSX has one, UP, BNSF. They also, in some way, shape, or form, have training trains, which are full-size props that they bring into the communities, train emergency responders on valves and fittings and safety and operating in a railroad environment, because it's not the same environment as working on a highway or a structure fire. If you're on a highway, if you're fire department, you're on the highway, you just turn on your lights and everybody stops. It doesn't work on the railroad. It takes over a mile to stop a freight train safely. And so it's a different environment. We spend a lot of time training them. The AAR has set up a training center out in Pueblo, Colorado. And again, they do charge for this, but and the gentleman we'll talk about in a few minutes here, Roy Holden, was one of the founding fathers of the tank car specialist course out there, that they have full-scale derailments that are piped with air and water. And fire departments go out there and train on how to respond to hazardous materials in a railroad environment. It's now called Security and Emergency Response Training Center, but a lot of what they do has remained the same. And the core of the course they teach now is pretty much the course that Roy Holden and the BOE developed way back in early 70s. There wasn't a lot of expertise out there for railroad emergency response. So when they set that up, they came back to the Bureau of Explosives and asked to use their BOE inspectors as guest instructors to add a little validity and real world experience to what they were teaching out in Pueblo.
There was a period in the 70s and 80s when there were an awful lot of bad tank car accidents. And we learned from each one of those. And we learned about tank car design and I don't know if car placement was modified at all, but mainly the design of cars to shelf couplers,
Head
shields, top fitting protection, bottom outlet protection, and safety valves. So the number of accidents has gone down tremendously.
And a lot of the data that the AAR and now it's the AAR rail safety, Bob, what is it, RSI, Jim?
It's the RSI AAR Tank Car Safety Research and Test Project.
Right. A lot of the data that for going back historically came out of what the BOE and the AAR gathered from all these years of old tank cars being involved in accidents.
Chris Barkin registered, I don't know if he's on the call, but he was working for Research and Test Department of the AAR at the time when he did this analysis of accident data. And this is better than just raw accident data because it's gives you a rate per carload, and the drop is pretty significant, pretty amazing, through better tank car design primarily.
Yeah, I'm here. I would say it was a combination of the significant reduction in the derailment rate combined with the improvement in the tank car design and its greater resistance to accidents if it was in an accident.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if I could, the subject of the hazmat school, if you guys want, I actually have a picture of the first TTC hazmat class, which if you let me share screen, I can show it to everybody. It's up to you.
We'll do that at the end, Chris.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks.
Paul, were you going to?
I was just, again, it relates to what I just said about the previous slide. The AAR was capturing information on tank car damage by tank cars type specification for years. The 111, which is the Volkswagen of the tank car fleet, as you can see, it's the number one on every year as far as tank cars involved in accidents. We, again, based on knowledge and experience and performance of tank cars in accidents, we improved tank car design, and now the latest 111 is going away, and it's been superseded by the new 117, which is the new general service tank car for flammable liquids. And incorporates all the safety features that you would find on a compressed gas car. You've got head shields, full height head shields on both ends. You've got a thicker tank, 9/16 versus 7/16. You've got bottom outlet protection. You have a bottom outlet valve that is disengaged in transportation. All the top fittings up on top are in a housing to prevent them from being destroyed in a derailment or reduce the likelihood thereof. So it's a much, much better car.
This is Al's baby.
Good thing it doesn't look like him.
Several years ago, the Bureau put out what was called a field guide to tank cars, and over the last several years we have updated this to the current 3rd edition. I understand now that the 4th edition will be forthcoming shortly, but this is a guide to tank cars for the emergency response personnel primarily, but anybody that's interested in tank cars. It is available for a free PDF download. I think you can just go to BOE.org or AAR.org, and it'll take you to the Bureau of Explosives, BOE, and you can download it. And in this nice cold winter time, it's fun reading at night.
Yeah, and the original guide was dedicated to Roy Holden.
Yep. In the 1990s, there was a lot of characteristic changes in the railroads. There was a lot of mergers, and so now there are fewer Class 1 railroads. Now, Class 1 railroad is a nomenclature for a certain class of revenue that a railroad has. But Class 1 railroads basically, and I'm going to be corrected here by Paul in a minute, but basically do most of the long haul for hazardous materials across the country of Canada and the United States and even into Mexico. But the short lines have their own association, and the last mile is, or the last point is usually by a short line. But the railroads found that they formed their own hazmat teams as they started to merge. And so now we have 7 Class 1 railroads, and each of those railroads have a significant hazmat team that does the training, participates with TransCare, works with their own communities that they go through, and their own shippers. And Paul can tell you a little bit more about what a Class 1 does with their shippers. The laboratory has been in existence for a long time, but there was an unfortunate accident in the lab in the latter part of the 1980s. And unfortunately, a lab technician lost his life in that process. And that really shifted the lab and closed the lab down. Alan Richter helped with that closure of the lab, so he would be more conversant in how that lab got closed. But the lab responsibilities went in different places. The Bureau of Mines was one of those places, and there were consulting organizations that now have been formed. Dr. Cheng, who is our chief chemist, his son participates in classifications, and there is a list of people who the Department of Transportation uses for classifications, and so that's farmed out. And then the AAR consolidated its groups. So,
mind if I just say a few words?
Yeah, please.
I became the director when one day after that, the lab had the accident. And the AAR's board of directors, when they found out what we were doing for that lab, they shut it down. Al Roberts was very angry that this happened. So what we ended up doing was letting Chang continue as a consultant to work on his own and present his information to the Department of Transportation so that they could identify that material and put it in the regulations. That's how we got out of it.
Thanks, Charlie.
In fact, I had to go up to New Jersey and meet with the widow of the person who passed away, along with I forget his name right now, but we had to go up and make our apologies.
Gary.
But it was pretty bad situation for me, just getting on the job as the director.
We didn't introduce Charlie Keller, but this was his introduction to the Bureau of Explosives.
And I had to work through it with Al Roberts, because he was relying on that lab whenever they would come up with that information on explosives and how to identify it and make it an explosive and how it was going to be regulated. And so he really pushed to continue with the lab, and so what we ended up doing was letting Chang work on his own, and we just cut him loose, and he was working directly for Al Roberts at that time.
Charles, could you remind us of Al Roberts' role at DOT at the time?
It was FRA.
Was it FRA?
Say that again.
Al Roberts' title at the time?
Yeah, he was it's now called PISMA, but he was the director of that operation involved with DOT's regulations. He headed that up.
Research and Special Programs Administration.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
And he was
I forget the name he had at that time, but he headed it up.
So then, Paul, do you want to cover the consolidation of the groups within AAR?
The AAR around that time also was looking at, again, as we noted earlier, membership is going down and expenses are not. So looking at ways to save money, perform functions better. They decided to do some consolidations. They sent the BOE out to Pueblo, Colorado. They sent, the technical services for the AAR, and the BOE was part of it, went out to Pueblo, Colorado. The Rail Inc., the data processing folks, Jim's group, they went to Cary, North Carolina. And around that time, they also got involved with doing quality assurance audits for the AAR at tank car shops. And as Ral noted earlier, the Bureau got revenue from membership and training and inspections, but the money from quality assurance audits and the requirements that the railroads wanted them and eventually DOT required them, there was more revenue in doing quality assurance audits than doing BOE hazmat audits and training. So they sort of morphed into what they are now, which is basically quality assurance auditors for tank car shops and tank car shop certifications. So they do very little, if any, really hazmat audits or training or anything at this point. They've pretty much transitioned to a full-time quality assurance group.
But that still meets the needs of the railroad. So
yes, still meets the needs of the railroad. We want to make sure that any tank car that is traveling on our tracks is built to at minimum, they have to be built to federal standards, but the AAR has interchange rules, and we can self-regulate by interchange rules and require something over and above the federal regulations. And one of which is anybody that performs repairs on tank cars has to have tank car facility has to have a quality assurance program. and they have to be certified by the AAR, Bureau of Explosives folks, that they meet their quality assurance program.
So that answers the question that we had in the chat about tank cars inspection. It's done by the railroads, Donna. So that gives you the information of the Bureau of Explosives. And now we'd like to shift a little bit and talk about what I consider to be the most lovable characters at the Bureau. Person that we all called Uncle Roy, and whose name was Roy J. Holden Jr., who was a mechanical engineer and worked for the American Car and Foundries for a great number of years. I think he had another gig with another car makers after that. And he was passionate about teaching us, and I'll speak for myself, but I think it was more broad than just me, about tank cars and about how to read a tank car. And he would regale me with stories about tank cars and show me X-ray images of the welds from tank cars. Whenever there was and the engineering drawings of tank cars, and he really wanted us to understand, what is a tank car made of? What is it? What are the fittings, and how to handle any accident that you might be coming out? So it's really, he was passionate about educating the inspectors and the rest of the staff about tank cars. He was also regaled us about boiling liquid expanding vapor explosions, we call BLEVs. And there were 2 or 3 of them that he really worried about that they not happen, and that, again, and injure any of our inspectors. So he was very adamant about how you recognize a BLEV potential and what you do if you have one. He was witty and irreverent, didn't suffer fools very easily, but he loved us fiercely and protectively. And he, as I said, he really did a lot for the training of not only our staff, but as Paul mentioned earlier, setting up the training at the Security Emergency Response Center in Pueblo, Colorado. And up there at the training center, there is a room named after him. He is sorely missed. It was a great, it was a sudden death, and we were all greatly affected.
And he could find anything from that mass of paper there when you needed it.
Yes,
That was his filing system, but he knew exactly where anything was in that desk.
I'm really surprised because that's the cleanest his office has ever been.
We had a new head of our operations come from Norfolk Southern, and he was taken through the various offices, and Roy's office looked just like that. And his comment when he looked at it, he said, "I think this man needs a bigger wastebasket."
but all of those papers, he had a use for them. I mean, I did see him throw stuff away, but those were the things he pulled from because those were top of mind. Those were the things he wanted to express to us.
And keep in mind, whenever the railroads had a major accident, Roy was one of the first people they called to find out why that tank car did what it did.
Yep.
He would go out to a number of these accidents as a personal observer to try to help them figure out what went wrong.
And he was an essential part of the AAR, the Association of American Railroads Tank Car Committee.
Well, he developed a tool that could be placed in a dent and determine whether or not it's safe. That's a good dent or a bad dent. But
yeah.
The dent guide.
So justifiably, the association recognized Roy's importance to the industry and formed in the late 90s, the Holden Prufrock Award, which is the highest award and the most prestigious for any professional working in hazardous materials by rail. And you will see among the awardees, we have on the phone, we have Charlie Wright, we have Al Mady, we have Paul Williams, and the rest of these folks are also part of the Bureau of Explosives as alumni that worked with us. So well-deserved, lads, well-deserved. Now, one of the things that we were drummed into, at least in my brain, from both the railroad service and the chemical industry service, was safety is everybody's job. I thought long and hard about how to close this presentation. And one of Colonel Dunn's bulletins gave me the perfect close, I think. And here it is. Picture of a tank car with the moniker in there. Somebody wrote this in memory of Henry Carr Tinker. Here lies the body of a careless Hank who lost regard for a leaky tank. Keep lights and fires away. That's what the placards say. He struck a match and let us pray. So the Bureau of Inspectors and the role of the inspector in helping self-police the railroads, in providing support network to the railroads, training to a whole constituency between railroads and shippers and first responders and firemen and policemen and community folks, to enforce the regulations that are out there, really help to make rail safe transportation. And
well, I was going to add that Ann and I have had a lot of fun doing this, putting this together. With a lot of help, obviously, but we'd like to continue the research. And I know there are a lot of knowledgeable people on the call. This is my email address. Feel free to contact me if you have any additional material to add or corrections, complaints. I'll take it all in. Thank you all very much. We have time for questions now. Are there, Scarlett, do we have any that haven't been addressed?
I want to see Chris's picture.
okay.
You guys see this?
Yes.
Yep. Is that J.J. O'Driscoll in the front row there on the left?
Yep, that's Jerry.
That's very cool.
Yeah, those are.
We have both Holden and Prufrock are here as well and a lot of other people you'll recognize.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure.
It's Jim McNally there, second from the left.
Right there, yep.
And is that
Pete
Ted
Conley,
Cully over top of Driscoll?
right there.
Mike Miller.
There's Mark Staley.
Mark Stay. Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that's
Where's Mike Miller?
He's on the first row, left to right, the kind of the middle of the first row, it looks like.
right? Isn't that Mike?
Oh, he's in the back. Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah, fourth from the left.
right
Next
there.
to Ted.
That's him.
okay. Thanks for showing that, Chris.
Sure.
All right, I think that wraps it up then. I just want to thank everyone who had a part in putting together this program for tonight, especially Ann and Jim, of course, Paul and Al and other industry experts who helped chime in tonight and made it such a great conversation. Also, thanks to Garen, who is behind the scenes helping out with the IT, the video, much appreciated. It's been a fascinating look into something that we really don't know much about if we're not in that world. If you've missed our other programs and wonder what we've been up to, they're all available on YouTube, on the DCNRHS YouTube channel. You just search for DCNRHS You'll see the icon with the Capitol Dome and the track there. And you can see some examples here of some of the things we've done. Two of the most, I think, obvious ones that stick out from the slide are talks from the executive director out at Western Maryland Scenic Railroad, where they're restoring the 1309, and also the East Broadtop Railroad, which of course is back in operation just as of this year. So if you are needing a railroad fix, some more programs, check those out. And then finally, earlier on, way back at the beginning, I mentioned our Dover Harbor card. It's a pretty unique preservation effort that we have, because we maintain the car in its original condition, and yet it's certified to Amtrak standards and it runs all over the country. Hasn't gone anywhere lately, but we're hoping to get it back out and about. And if you're interested in knowing when that happens, you can go to our chapter website, and over on the left you can sign up for a trip news that will notify you when trips are planned. So again, I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, and appreciate our speakers. Once again, great program, and we hope to see you next month. Thanks.